Well, good afternoon, everybody. I can tell by the noise in the room you're really, really excited about macroeconomics this semester. Yes. My name is Steve Wood, and I'm the instructor for this class, which is 100B, ECON 100B, Macroeconomic Analysis. Hopefully that's what you're here for. Good, good. So just to give you an idea, this is a class in intermediate macroeconomics. So presumably you've had Econ 1 or 2, where you spent at least part of the semester talking about macroeconomics. So we will be building and extending what you learned in that class with two particular goals in mind. One is to develop some economic models to help us explain various macroeconomic events. And then the other is to actually take those models and apply them to both historical events and actually maybe even think about trying to make some predictions about what the job market might look like by the time you graduate, which might be something you would be interested in knowing. But we'll talk about how we can use these models to get some sort of inference about where the economy will be going over the next number of years. This is a particularly interesting time to be a macroeconomist or to study macroeconomics because more has gone on in the last 5 years than what we have probably seen in terms of macroeconomic upsets in the previous 50 years. And economics is one of the, macroeconomics at least, is one of those disciplines where the great advances are only made out of great tragic events, such as we've had recently. So it actually turns out the last major advance in macroeconomics was actually done right after the Great Depression in the 1930s. We had another leap forward in macroeconomic theory and modeling in the 1970s and the early 1980s when we had both recessions, economic contractions, and high rates of inflation. But everything else has been fairly incremental since then. But now I suspect that over the next 5 years, we're going to see a great flowering of macroeconomics. So we're studying this really at the most opportune time. And the fact that most of you aren't going to be graduating in May makes it better yet on that score. Our textbook is Frederick Mishkin, Macroeconomics, Policy and Practice. Just to let you know, this is as you haven't figured out, a brand new textbook. It was literally published 2 weeks ago. So I picked this book for a couple of reasons. One is for the fact that if you've ever used a textbook that's been in a 5th edition or a 10th edition, one of the things that especially if you've looked at older editions versus a newer edition, one of the things that you'll find is the changes from one edition to the next are very incremental. When an author sits down to write a textbook, there's a huge fixed cost associated with that. The marginal cost of coming out with another edition is not all that great if you're not making all those many changes. The problem is those legacy costs, that heavy fixed cost of having written that book initially 5 or 10 years ago, still weighs very heavily on the authors. They don't want to start from scratch. But lots and lots of new things have happened in macroeconomics in the last 5 years. So if we were using a book that had initially been written more than 5 years ago, there would be a lot of things in there that were kind of the old way of doing it. We wouldn't find much that would even be talking about the current economic environment of the last several years. This textbook does, and therefore it is much more current and actually changes the approach that many of the other older textbooks have taken. So that's the primary reason that I selected this book. Now I know it's outrageously expensive, and I apologize for that. For those of you who have not bought the hardback edition, you can get from Amazon.com a student value edition, which is just a loose leaf version of the same textbook. I think it already comes 3-hole punch. It's a bit cheaper, but it's not cheap. And obviously, having just been published 2 weeks ago, there are no used books on the market yet. Well, I suppose after the semester, well, hopefully this will be a book that you will appreciate enough that you will want to keep. Okay, just a couple of other things real quick. I asked you to pay attention to the syllabus that I emailed out as well as posted on BSpace, but there are a few things that I just want to highlight very quickly. Did you have a question? Yes, ma'am. Okay, so the question was somebody ordered the loose leaf version from Amazon, but it won't deliver until the first week of February, which is what, 2 weeks from today? So if you've got a friend who's got the hardback edition, maybe you could share for a little while. You could probably get through 2 weeks without a textbook. I wouldn't want to go much beyond that unless you think that, of course, I'm just an absolutely sterling lecturer. I am, but I don't know that you think that. But at some point, you're going to want to have the textbook for reinforced reading. But what we do, especially this week, is really fairly easy and definitional, and I think the lecture notes cover most of that. Next week, things start to get a little bit more complicated, but the third week, that first full week in February, things are really going to ramp up. Yes, ma'am. Yes. The question was, is the hardback book at the Cal store? And the answer is it should be there, and it should be at Ned's as well. At least I ordered a gazillion of them. Okay, so in terms of classroom supplies, two things that you will need. One is a set of colored pens and pencils, or you can get one of those 4-color pens, the ones that have the annoying clicks with black and red and blue and green in it. That's probably preferable. It's always nice during exams to hear you all changing colors. But in economics, as you know, we shift lots of curves around, and it's so much easier when we do them in different colors, which is why you will need that. You will see as I draw things, I will do different colors on problem sets and exams. You will also need to do things in different colors as well. We're also using iClicker, so you'll all need an iClicker device. So hopefully most of you have gotten that and registered that. We will start today, although no grading will take place for today. So you want to go ahead and get that as soon as you can. And you can register online if you have a new one at iclicker.com/registration. Just fill in the information that you need. Attendance. So a couple of things. We won't take attendance in class because if we did, it would take 80 minutes to do so, and we wouldn't have time for anything else, and that wouldn't be much fun. The econ department does require attendance during the first week of the class or the semester, and for some reason they told me the first week was the 18th through the 25th, which means that if you have a Tuesday, Thursday discussion section, you have 3. I don't know how these things work. But anyway, we will be taking attendance of both the class list and the wait list and discussion section. We do have 60 people on the wait list, so you do need to be present or have an excused absence, and the only person who can give you an excused absence is me. Did you have a question? No. Thought I saw your hand go up. So hopefully those of you who had Tuesday, Thursday discussion sections were there this morning or early afternoon, because I know we have a bunch of sections then. Let me emphasize, if you're on the wait list, I can't do anything except answer your questions. I'm not going to be able to add you to the class. I just can't do that. Enrollment is handled automatically through Telebears. A registered student drops off. Who's ever first on the wait list moves into the class automatically. My experience from past semesters is that the entire wait list does not get cleared. So that's the downside. Now, you do have some alternatives. Macroeconomics is being taught elsewhere on campus. Up at the Haas School of Business, UGBA 101B is an alternative. It does count towards the economics major as a replacement for this class. There are 2 sections being taught by David Levine, Monday and Wednesdays. You can see the times up there. I checked just before I came down here. There's plenty of room in both of them. Plenty of room. So you may find that I'm a sterling lecturer. I don't know. Not so much room here, lots of room there. Okay. 100B is offered again in the, well, it's generally offered in the summer. It's offered, in fact, every semester. It will be offered again in the fall as well as next spring. So if you don't get in, you're not completely out of luck. Macroeconomics is also offered in the International Area Studies area, but that class between the registered students and the wait list is over its full subscribed level, so I didn't put that up there. Instructor approvals, a misnomer, because I don't approve anything. They go to the head GSI in the econ department. So somebody had asked me earlier, who do I beg and plead with to get into the class? Juan Carlos Soares is the one. So you can either, you should email him as opposed to go visit him. He's not that friendly a person. No, he's a nice enough guy. But he can basically answer any questions you have about enrollment because other than what I've just told you, I don't know anything about enrollment. If you haven't done so already and either met your discussion section or didn't do this morning, please write a letter of introduction to your GSI just to help them learn who you are a little more quickly and get to know something about you. Name, picture would be helpful, be able to place you. Year, major, why you're taking the course. I know some of you are required. Some of you are, I just love macroeconomics, can't get enough. Anything else you might want to put down. Graded assignments. So we have 5 major graded assignments. There will be iClicker grades based on your both participation and perhaps even your correctness in response. Relatively low, but 5%. That's enough to make a difference in somebody's grade. We'll have problem sets worth 25% of your grade in 3 exams, and you can see the various dates for the exams there. Your GSI, the GSI for your discussion section, the discussion section that you're registered for, is going to grade all of your work. So if you decide to change discussion sections, just 2 hints. One is wait until after the first week, where we don't have to take attendance. So that makes it much easier. But do it before the first problem set is due, which probably won't be until week 3 or maybe early in week. It'll be in week 3, I'm sure. So that'll give you a little window of opportunity. That way we can make sure you have just one GSI grading your work for the entire semester. Problem sets will be due at the beginning of class. So when you come here when they're due, you'll find your GSI wherever they may be scattered about the room. Hand them your problem set, and then we'll get the class started. We need to have your name, SID, and your GSI's name on your form. Your explanations on your problem sets will need to be word processed. I know it's a pain in the neck in other places, but this will help the GSIs grade more quickly and give us a faster turnaround time. Once I call time on the days that they're due, which is generally 5 or 10 minutes into the class time, we will not accept any further problem sets. So we're not taking late problem sets. Don't ever email or try to fax or slide problem sets under my door. I don't know what to do with them. Just a couple of things about problem sets. You can work in groups to figure out how to solve the problem, to check your calculations, to sort of figure out what your answers are to discussion questions, but I expect the problem set that you turn in to be in your own words, so your explanation. Do not copy, edit other people's explanations. We're trying to give you practice in actually trying to solve these problems. So we're looking for your own effort. Believe me, it happens every semester. Somebody decides, last moment, I didn't get around to my problem set. Let me just cut and paste yours. Not a good idea. on many, many different levels. And in any event, whether your own personal reputation means much to you or not, I'm going to actually ask you to sign a little statement that says that the work you're turning in is in fact your own work. 3 exams. Again, you can see the dates, February 22nd. I will point out that that is after the end of the 5th week. So if that makes a difference to you in terms of whether you're going to take the class or not, you probably will have to decide before that. So anyway, those are the exam dates that we have. Exams are closed book, closed notes, so you don't need to bring anything to the exam period. I will give you a complete exam packet, so it'll be a packet of, 8 or 10 or 12 or 14 pages. Has scratch paper in it. This is where all your answers are going to go. You'll turn in the whole thing. No electronic devices of any kind, with the exception of language translators, which I must at least look at to make sure that you don't have a memory in your language translator with all the lecture notes on it. It has happened in the past. So, and again, you'll need your pens and pencils. Again, you'll have a test affirmation to sign that the work you're doing is yours and not your neighbor's. I always point out, unless you know your neighbor's a lot smarter than you are, there's probably not much, it's probably not worth the risk of trying to write down their answers anyway. Regrade requests, just a couple of things. If it's just arithmetic, sometimes the GSIs have brain freezes, just like all the rest of us. All you need to do is see your GSI, and they can take care of that right away. If you are objecting to the way it was graded, the interpretation of the grading, then you need to have a written request, meaning word processed, to give back to your GSI within 1 week of when the exams were first returned in discussion section, laying out exactly what you think was misgraded and why. GSIs reserve the right to regrade any part of the exam, including what you've asked for. And we ask that you never, ever ask for a regrade request for only 1 or 2 points. It's not, first of all, 1 or 2 points on an exam is not going to make any difference in terms of your letter grade, and it's not a good use of your time or your GSI's time. For your course letter grade, we have the same weightings that I showed earlier in these 5 areas. You might notice for the problem sets, if I didn't say this on the earlier slide, there will be 6 problem sets. We will only count the highest 5. So if you decide you don't want to do one, that's perfectly fine. Now, we take great care to ensure that the same quality of work is assigned the same letter grade. And I do that in 2 ways, and it seems to have worked pretty well historically, so we'll continue to do that. The first is I make up my own exams, and I make up a suggested solution set, and I also make up a detailed grading grid for the GSIs, so that I'm giving them their guidance in terms of how many points to take off for mistakes, or to give for the positive side. So what I found by doing that is, even though we have 360 students in 12 discussion sections with 6 GSIs, the variation in the grades between the GSIs, if you looked at mean, medians, and standard deviations, is generally not very great. So that tells me that by giving them very, very specific instructions on how to grade, we're keeping roughly the same quality of work across discussion sections. The other part of grading is that your grade, your letter grade, will be determined within your GSI's 2 discussion sections. So if it turns out that we've got one GSI who's a really tough grader and another GSI who's a very lenient grader, and there are some differences, more than we would anticipate, the people with a really strict GSI are not going to be penalized on their letter grades compared to the students who have a fairly lenient GSI. because you'll only be compared within that, those two discussion sections. The combined discussion sections are in the neighborhood of 55 to 70, so these are relatively large groups, so we have historically gotten fairly normally distributed grading curves, so it seems to me that that works really well. Now, I also say that there's no preset or common grading scale, and there's no fixed grading curve. All of that is true. That's not to say that I have no standards at all. I do, but it is possible if everybody does really, really well, that everybody could get an A. It's also equally possible that if everybody does really mediocre, that everybody could get a C. Now, I know that's not going to happen, at least the latter. I hope the former does. I hope I'm a good enough professor that that can happen. So there is some room in final grading for me to exercise some judgment within and across discussion sections. But as I say, when we get into problem sets and exams, this will all probably begin to make more sense in terms of how you want to compare yourself, trying to figure out, well, what kind of letter grade am I going to get? And I'll give you some more guidance on that aspect once we get through the first exam. Are there any questions on anything that I've covered so far, or on the syllabus as you've read it or perused it or not read it or not perused it, or questions about class policy? Yes, sir. Are the exams cumulative? Not intentionally, and I say that way because macroeconomics is cumulative. So the stuff that we do at the beginning is going to be important for the stuff we do in the middle, which will be important for the stuff we do at the end. But the kind of specific questions that I would ask you on the first exam, I would not ask you those kinds of specific questions on the second or third exam. But that second or third exam may refer back to information that we had talked about in the first section of the course. So if you take exam 1 and you completely flush your memory banks, and then you come into exam 2, you're probably going to have a little more difficulty than if you can actually remember some of this stuff. Oh, I might just point out that exam number 3, which is our final exam, will actually look exactly like exam number 1 and 2 in terms of format, in terms of how long it is. So exam 1 and 2, of course, are written to be able to be, well, you'll have 80 minutes to do it. They're written to take 3 hours and 40 minutes. That's joking. Thank you. Now, they're designed to press you a little bit, but be able to be finished in 80 minutes. The final exam should also be able to finish in 80 minutes, but the university says you have 3 hours to take it, so that's fine. So the final exam, at least, you got plenty of time. So if you feel really stressed about the time on the first exam, that shouldn't, or first or second exam, that shouldn't be an issue on the final exam. Yes, sir. Extra credit, it's how good you feel about yourself at the end of the class. Anything else? Yes, ma'am. 4. So we need black, which could be a pencil, red, green, and blue. So that should cover it. It may be that on a problem set we may need a 5th color, but normally on exams you would just need black, red, blue, and green. Yes, one more question. So the question was, how specifically does the iClicker grading work? And the answer is, I don't know yet. Okay, I don't know yet. So when I kind of figure out how to capture all the information, how to look at all the information, I'll let you know. So it's just going to be kind of free-floating here at the beginning. The question was, will I be posting lecture slides before or after each lecture? I post my lecture slides before each lecture. So right now, I think the first 3 lecture slides are already posted. They'll all be on BSpace. I should have lecture 4 up sometime tomorrow, lecture 5 up no later than Friday, 6 and 7, I try and stay it's a brand new book, so I'm redoing my lecture notes too. So trying to make my old notes consistent with the new material. Yes, sir? Because I wanted to keep the problem sets at 25%, and I needed to get 5% for the iClicker questions. So I needed to take it from somewhere. So I guess I could have made them all 21 3/4 or whatever, or a third or whatever it worked out to be, but I didn't. Yes? I'm sorry? Do you need to re-register your iClickers? I'm told yes. I don't know why, but I'm told yes. There was something that they told me or showed me that said you should re-register your iClicker. So yes, if you have an iClicker, already had an iClicker, you should re-register it. Okay. Now that the questions are over, are there any more questions? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about macroeconomics. So we need to think about kind of 2 things within the context of macroeconomics. And recently, meaning the last couple of years, there has actually been a fairly raging debate about both the practice of macroeconomics as well as macroeconomic policy. And within the context of the practice of macroeconomics, what I mean by that is there has been a debate about how the economy is actually structured. Does the economy work the way those other guys think it does? Or does it work the way we think that it does? And this debate has been raging quite fiercely, and it has significant implications. As we will see as we move through the course, not all economists agree with each other. We don't go to our annual convention, sit in a big circle, and sing Kumbaya. There's lots of heated debate about what is going on. So what I'm going to try and do within the broad context of macroeconomic theory and modeling that we do is give you sort of what is thought of as the mainstream view, but also talk about some of the disagreements and arguments and objections that have been raised in that score. We've also seen a great deal of argument about macroeconomic policy. As you may know, Christina Romer, a professor here in the economics department, was President Obama's chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, very influential in the first stimulus program that was passed by Congress and signed by the president in February of 2009. There have been people who thought that that was exactly the right policy to put in place at that time. There were some people who thought it was not the right policy because it was way too small given the order of magnitude of the economic problems that we had at that time. And there were other economists who said, completely wrong problem. That's not the right policy. You've misinterpreted even what the problem is, therefore the policy's not right. And by the way, even if you had interpreted the problem correctly, you still got the policy wrong. So as you can see, there can be lots of disagreement in that score. So let's take a question. So I gotta get going here. So get up. Okay. Okay. Start. Okay, so what is the greatest macroeconomic challenge facing the United States today? High unemployment, rapidly rising tuition, massive government budget deficits, or potential deflation? So that's what we want to ask ourselves. Okay? Everybody voted? Okay, we're going to stop here. Okay, so let's see what we said. What is wrong with this? Okay. Don't tell me. Do it this way. Okay, well, it looks like somehow I have messed up. Okay, so my mess up. I apparently brought the wrong clicker. I don't know how that happened. So what do we think? Somebody want to pick one? Pick two? Pick three? All four? All four. Okay, so it actually turns out that A, C, and D are in fact pretty big macroeconomic challenges facing the economy today. B is not a macroeconomic issue. It may be very important to you and or your parents, but it turns out that that actually is a microeconomic issue. Not to say that it's not important. It's just not one of the things that we'll be talking about in this class. Okay, since apparently I can't get the results to show, which I'll have to figure out why. Worked in my office before class, so I don't know why it's not working here. Technology. Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't know. Ah, there we go. Oh. Except it says question 3. Okay. So I'm technologically challenged. Okay. Okay. So, yeah. How do we get rid of this? Okay, so let's do number 2 then. Okay, let's vote on this. Same question, but very different answer. Well, maybe not very different answers. Potential hyperinflation, large international trade deficits, the high price of textbooks, China's trade policies. Okay, you're slowing down, so we're going to stop it here then. Okay, let's see. What did we say? Okay, display worked before. It doesn't seem to be working now. There we go. Large international trade deficit seems to be the winner here with 61% of the vote. But notice that a number of you think potential hyperinflation could be a real problem here. And not so many people. Who voted for E? Okay. And 9% thought that China's trade policies. So we're going to look at some of these issues about deflation and hyperinflation. We'll define some of those in the next couple of sections. And we'll look at that towards the end of the semester where we're talking about inflation in general. Trade deficits we'll also look at. They are a significant issue for the economy. China's trade policies, when we talk about international trade and exchange rates, we'll also talk about China's trade policies at that time as well. Okay, so the first thing that we need to understand is what macroeconomics is all about, right? And so macro, of course, means big. So this is talking about the economy at the large level, or this is the sort of 20,000-foot aerial view of what's going on in the economy. So we're looking at national economic activity and prices primarily. But it's actually more specific than that. We're also looking at the structure, how the economy is actually built, what the dynamic adjustment mechanism is. How is it that the economy moves over time? What is it that causes economic growth to speed up or slow down? Inflation to accelerate or decelerate? So, and then how would we measure the performance of the economy? So we've got to have all of those types of things in there. And then we also need to think about the macroeconomic policies. You may remember from Econ 1, monetary policy and fiscal policy in particular, how those types of policies can actually affect the overall economic outcome. The process that we are going to use is by developing economic models. So economic models are simply a simple way of trying to explain very complex behaviors in a relatively simple and straightforward shorthand. Now, it's absolutely impossible for us to capture all of the rich detail in variations of what's happening in the economy if we're going to talk about it in anything that is more than just a shorthand. Now, we're going to do this, that is, develop what measuring and talking about the structure and performance of the economy, first by talking about economic theory. That is, what do we hypothesize the relationship between various variables should be? And then we're going to put that theory into a model. So again, a model is just going to be a very simplified description of how things work. Now, in order to develop that model, we generally follow a 8-step process. It may end up being more than 8 steps, but these are the 8 steps that we at least start off with. Got to have an interesting issue. What is it that we want to study? What is it we're trying to explain? Then we need to specify what are known as the endogenous variables. Whoops. The endogenous variables. Who can tell me what an endogenous variable is? A definition, not an example of. Yes, sir. Okay. So an endogenous variable is really the variable whose movements we're trying to explain. So for instance, if we were interested in the question, how is the unemployment rate related to, say, changes in government spending or taxing policy? What we would want to be explaining is movements in the unemployment rate. So the unemployment rate here would be an example of an endogenous variable. This is the variable that the model will try to explain the movements of. We also need to specify what we think the exogenous variables are. Now, exogenous variables are taken as given. They're not what we're trying to explain. They're rather the variables that we're using to explain something else. Now, in very complicated models, we can have lots and lots and lots of endogenous variables as well as lots and lots of exogenous variables. Most of the models that we are going to develop are going to be relatively simple in terms of the number of endogenous and exogenous variables. But as you'll see with some of the data that we'll look at, we'll still be able to explain a vast majority of the fluctuations. So simple models, yes, but still with a very high explanatory effect. So once we know what we're trying to explain and what variables we're going to use to explain it with, we also then need to hypothesize what that relationship looks like. So if this goes up, does this variable go up or down? Is it a linear relationship or is it a nonlinear relationship? So those types of questions. Now, third, we need to empirically test the relationship. What we mean by this is you need to go capture some data from the real world, movements in the unemployment rate, changes in government spending or tax rates. That is, we've got to have real data, and then to use mathematical and statistical concepts to find out whether or not that relationship actually holds up the way we hypothesized. That is, were we right or were we wrong in our initial hypothesis? If that's where we evaluate the results. So once we've run all the statistical econometric results, now we can say, were we right or were we wrong in terms of our initial hypothesis? If we were wrong, or if we were right but only weakly right, it kind of explains it, but probably not as strongly as we think. Now we go back and have to rethink what our exogenous variables are and what that relationship may be. And so there can be a circular flow from 6 back to 4. If we get some reasonable results, then we can make further predictions using that model, which is why businesses do this kind of an approach. And we might also want to formulate a policy if we were working in the government and had the ability to change government spending, tax policy, monetary policy, or any of the other levers that the government has for controlling the economy. So this is the sort of general process that one goes through in terms of developing a macro model. Now, we're not going to actually sit down and do all of this, but I will show you the results of a lot of the macro models that we do use, at least in terms of the basic relationships between variables. Now, it's important to keep in mind that when we look at things in a two-dimensional graph, we're only looking at a very simple relationship of one variable versus the other. There are very, very few things in economics where only one explanatory variable provides most of the explanation for the movements in our endogenous variable. So we have to keep that in mind, that real models, and we'll look at how we deal with that in two-dimensional space, are much more complicated. Now the question then is, okay, if we know how to build models, what are we mostly interested in explaining? And macroeconomics is generally about 3 major variables and a whole bunch of subcomponents on these. So the 3 major variables are something that we call real GDP, which is the economist's measure of overall economic activity. And we'll talk about this in excruciating detail on Thursday. The unemployment rate, which you can probably figure out what that means, but we'll also give you a very specific definition on Thursday, and inflation. So these give us sort of the 3 core variables that we spend most of our time talking about at a very high level. So again, real GDP is just real gross domestic product. So you can see gross, the G, domestic, D, product, P. Again, we'll come back to this. And gives us some measure of the production that is taking place in the economy over some period of time. When we have fluctuations in real GDP, we refer to those as business cycles. When the economy is falling, real GDP is contracting, we have a recession. And when it's growing, we have an expansion. So believe it or not, the economy has actually been expanding since the summer of 2009. We had a very nasty recession in 2008 in the first half of 2009. So again, we'll come back to that later, because one of the things we'll be interested in being able to answer is what causes recessions? Why was this one so nasty? It really was really nasty. And are there government policies that could either ameliorate the severity of the recession or perhaps prevent the recession from happening in the first place? So those are things that we'll look at a little bit later. Here's a graph of real GDP, not per capita, but per capita. So this is not just real GDP. It's not just economic output, but economic output per person in the United States. Again, one thing to notice is most of the time it's rising, right? It's growing over time, which is what we would like. But you also see that there are periods of time where we've had sharp declines. You can particularly see that recently. Now, if you can look closely, and I'm not sure you can all see this, but there are little gray bars here. Those gray bars are periods that reflect recessions. So what we should see is those gray bars should pretty much align with where real GDP per capita is falling. It's not a perfect correlation, but it's very, very high. And we'll talk about why it's not a perfect correlation later. But again, you can see that GDP has been moving up. 1955, $15,000 per person. Now just shy of $42,000, $43,000 per person. This, by the way, is also a measure, an economic measure of standards of living. This is how many goods and services are being produced per person, but those goods and services being produced are also bought by somebody. So our total spending on what's being produced has increased as well. So we're able to produce more, we're also able to buy more. Now this chart, similar data, not quite the same. This is actual real GDP, but rather than looking at the level, this is looking at its growth rate, its rate of change over the previous 4 quarters. So real GDP is measured on a quarterly basis, so it's looking at one quarter compared to the same quarter in the prior year. So it tells us really how much economic output has changed over the course of that year, or those 4 quarters. Again, notice that where all the gray bar recession areas are, the growth rate of GDP typically goes negative. And you can see why this one was nasty, and we were much more negative than anything that we had seen in the post-1950 period. Also notice, however, there are periods of time, like in 2001, where real GDP over the course of a year never fell into negative territory. We had a recession, but the economy, at least measured on a 4-quarter basis, never actually contracted. So you might be able to figure out, gee, this was probably a fairly mild recession, as was this one in 1970. Again, we'll talk about recessions, what causes them, how we get out of them in much more detail a bit later. Yes. So the question was, why do I have this chart going back to 1955 and this chart going back to 1950? Because in my database, I have this data going back to 1948. And the earlier one, I only have population estimates going back to 1955. So I was trying to give you as much history as I could during this period of time. Data exists further back, but I don't have easy access to it. Okay, the other piece of data that we're particularly interested in is the unemployment rate. Now, the unemployment rate just measures the percentage of people in the labor force who are out of work, actively seeking work during some particular time period, right? So we generally ask at a specific point in time, do you have a job? You don't. Okay. Are you looking for work? Oh, you are. Okay. Then there's a series of other questions, and depending upon those answers, we say, aha, you're unemployed. And that's how we would measure that unemployment rate. So here's an example of the unemployment rate itself and what it has done fairly recently. And so, again, you can see the unemployment rate moves up and down actually quite a bit. Now notice, during the economic expansions, the periods of time that would be shaded white in here, the unemployment rate is generally declining. And during recessions, the unemployment rate generally rises very quickly. And indeed, one of the things that you can see is the unemployment rate in this most recent recession has risen the most from trough to peak that we've seen in the post-World War II period. We never got to as high an unemployment rate as we did in 1982, but the unemployment rate started at a much higher level before that recession began. So this is, again, another measure of the performance of the economy, but we'd also like to be able to explain what is it that causes the unemployment rate to be as volatile as what it is. The third major variable that we have is inflation. And inflation is nothing more than how fast the overall price level is rising. The emphasis here is on the overall price level. Now again, we'll talk about how we measure that on Thursday. But this is the reason that the price of textbooks or the price of tuition would not be considered as a macroeconomic event. Those are the prices of specific items rather than the overall price level. So again, inflation is a measure of how fast the overall price level is rising. We also have, however, something called deflation, which is when the overall price level is declining. Now, most people think, wow, that sounds like shopping when there's a sale. Prices are lower. This must be a good thing. In macroeconomic terms, deflation is almost never a good thing. Japan has been basically trapped in a deflation environment for much of the last 10 years. And we'll talk much later about exactly why deflation can cause some very severe economic problems. At the other extreme, we have an occurrence of what is known as hyperinflation. Now, hyperinflation is typically defined as an inflation rate of 40% per month or more. By the way, that's 1,000% per year. Inflation last year in the United States was between 2 and 3%. So just to give you an idea. The country with the greatest hyperinflation right now is Zimbabwe, although it's not clear that they have any inflation anymore since there are no prices anymore because the economy has fallen apart. Hyperinflation is a really, really nasty thing. We'll talk again about that in more detail later. So here's the Consumer Price Index, one measure of overall price level in the United States. And again, its change over the course of a year. So again, notice that there have been a couple of times where we've seen inflation spike really, really high in the mid-1970s and the early 1980s. And in fact, if you look at this from about 1955 on, the trend on inflation was always higher until the early 1980s. The trough, the lowest level that inflation gets, continues to climb, and the peaks continue to climb. And then all of this, and this, especially in this period, from the mid-70s to the mid-80s, was referred to as the Great Inflation. We're not very original in economics, so we like to have, very obvious terms. And you'll notice something probably fairly dramatic must have happened in the early 80s because inflation came down a lot and has been sort of trending lower with some volatility since then. The period since 1982 is known as the Great Moderation. Told you we weren't very original. Okay, so that's the data that we're going to be looking at. So again, one of the things that we've got to be able to explain here is why all these wild fluctuations in this? What happened in here? Also, what happened here? Notice this is deflation. Those are negative terms. Prices are falling. Notice that had not happened since the mid-1950s. So again, as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that makes this a particularly interesting time to be studying macroeconomics is there's a lot of things that are going on that we haven't seen for a very, very long period of time. Okay, so that's kind of the data. So then we need to also think about the policies that we are going to use. So macroeconomic policies are those policies that can be used to try to affect the outcome of the macroeconomy. Now, it gets very confusing because some policies can actually be micro in nature, but also have macroeconomic consequences. I'll give you an example. Healthcare reform. Trying to reform the healthcare or the healthcare insurance industry is actually a microeconomic event. But the health insurance and the healthcare industry are so large relative to the total size of the overall economy, they're also likely to have macroeconomic impacts. In general, we're not going to talk about those types of policies. We're going to talk about truly macro types of policies, monetary policy, fiscal policy. We'll also talk about exchange rate policy as well. Oh, another question. Oh, this should be fun. So, should macro policies be used to affect macroeconomic outcomes? Yes, market outcomes can be undesirable. No, let the market determine the outcome. Okay. Now, these questions are one source of debate amongst macroeconomists. You might also know that these questions or these answers are also one source of debate amongst politicians. So sometimes it's nice to think that macroeconomics can be completely divorced from the political arena. Unfortunately, it rarely works out that way. Okay, so let's stop this. Let's see, what do we say? Come on. Okay. Yes. Okay. 77% said yes, 22% said no, 1% of you said D. Okay, so that's your grade. Okay. I'm actually surprised that that's the way the answer came out, but it is what it is. So we'll go from there, go and learn from there. Okay, but this will be an issue, and again, we'll talk later when we get into what we call stabilization policy. We'll talk about what some of these specific issues are. Okay, so let's think about what some macroeconomic policies might be. So one of the first things that we're going to look at in the next couple of weeks is what can poor countries do to become less poor? Actually, what can poor countries do to become rich? Now, we've got many examples of countries that have actually made this transition very successfully. Japan has done it. Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan have done it. China's in the process of doing it. India's in the process of doing it. Brazil is in the process of doing it. Botswana is in the process of doing it. So we've got a number of examples that are countries that have either successfully made the transition from essentially being poor countries not so long ago to relatively rich countries today. The question, though, that we have is there something in their experience, and for that matter, Western Europe, the United States, Canada's experience, in an earlier time period that can give us a set of rules or policies that's going to help other poor countries make that transition? So that's what we want to look at. A second policy question is saving too low? Now notice saving here does not have an S at the end. I'll talk about that next week. I think next week, why it doesn't have an S. But is saving too low? One of the things that we'll see is that saving is very important to how much investment takes place in an economy. And how much investment takes place in the economy helps to determine what its level of productive assets are. Machinery and factories and buildings and computers and all those other kinds of things, which can have a major impact on how much an economy can produce, both in the short run, but particularly in the long run. This is the personal savings rate. It's not the only saving that takes place in the U.S., but this is the personal savings rate for the United States. Again, you notice in the mid-70s, early 80s, this personal savings rate was around 10%. It fell to about 1% in 2005 and has shot dramatically higher since then. Again, our macroeconomic models that we'll want to develop will also need to explain this kind of behavior. Why did savings decline, the saving rate decline so dramatically? What has caused it to move back up? And also, what are the consequences, both of that long downward movement in the savings rate as well as this sharp upward adjustment in the rate? And again, we'll want to ask ourselves, are there government policies that we can use to influence where that savings rate is? A third big question of macroeconomics is, do budget deficits, government budget deficits, matter? Now, this may have been a more relevant question 3 or 4 years ago, but given what's been taking place in Europe recently and some of the discussions that we're even having in this country, it appears that people are getting more and more exercised about the size of budget deficits. So a budget deficit is simply when the government spends more than it receives in tax revenues. In fiscal policy is what determines what those budget deficits will be. Fiscal policy being the government's decisions about government spending and taxing policy. So this is a chart of the federal government's budget deficits as a percent of the GDP. So this is relative to the size of the economy. So remember, the size of the economy has grown dramatically over the years. So this isn't dollar terms, this is percent terms. And you can see several things here. One is the deterioration in the budget deficit during the 60s, 70s, and the 80s. A huge improvement to actual budget surpluses, surprisingly enough, during the 90s to the early 2000s, and then this big sharp drop. Now notice, this is 2010 right here. We're looking at something around 8 or 9% of GDP, call it 10 in round numbers. And on the administration's projections, the budget deficit never gets more than about 3% or 3.5% of GDP, even over the next 10 years. So can we live with something like that? What are the consequences? Are there consequences? What are they? And then, of course, we have to ask ourselves another polling question, which is, how should the government deficit be? How should the budget deficit be reduced? Only cut government spending, only raise taxes, do both, ignore the problem and hope it goes away. Now, I didn't put D down there actually to elicit a chuckle. Hope it did, so I'm glad that it did. But quite frankly, we've known about most of the longer-term budget problems for not just years. Actually, we've known about them for decades. And we haven't done anything about addressing them in any sort of serious adult way. So this is... Okay, see, I got work to do between now and... There we go. Okay, so you're the great compromisers. You want to do some of both. Cut spending and raise taxes. Okay? Well, I hate to tell you, you're young enough, your taxes will go up. And your government benefits probably will go down as well. Okay, but notice we've got, some people only want to cut spending. Some people only want to raise taxes. Most people are willing to take some sort of compromise. We will look at the consequences. Again, one of the things that we need to understand is, what are the consequences of only cutting government spending, both in the short run and in the intermediate to long run? What are the consequences of raising taxes, again, in the short run as well as in the long run? So those things will be very important for us, and we'll look at that in much more detail going forward. Okay, another question that concerns macroeconomists is, how costly is it to reduce inflation? If you remember back to the inflation chart that we saw before, there was a big drop in the inflation rate from the early 1980s to, sort of the mid-1980s. We went from double-digit inflation down to about 4 or 5% inflation. But what are the consequences of having that? What are the costs associated with that? If you go back and you look at the unemployment chart, one of the things that you will see is that the unemployment rate went very, very high during that period of time. Are those two concepts related? Do we need to have high unemployment in order to bring down inflation? Or is bringing down inflation something that causes high unemployment? We need to think about those kinds of issues. We also need to think, if we're stuck with high inflation, are there ways to bring it down where we can reduce the cost? As we'll see next week, inflation is primarily the responsibility of a country's central bank. In the United States, that's the Federal Reserve System. And central banks exercise that responsibility through monetary policy by changes in either how fast the money supply grows or changes in short-term interest rates. A question that almost nobody was asking until a couple of years ago is there a way we can reduce the frequency and severity of financial crises? A financial crisis is a period of time in which the financial system, financial institutions, and the financial system become disrupted. And typically, financial crises also involve asset prices falling sharply, where assets might be stocks or bonds or the price of housing or other types of ways of holding wealth. So here's just an example of what's happened to the stock market. This is the Standard & Poor's 500 index. You can see before the recession started, the index was just shy of 1,600, fell to a low of about 750. So it fell by 50%. Now, it's gone up by 50% since then. But remember, if you go down by 50% and then up by 50%, you're still down by 25%. Right? 100 dropped by 50%, you're down to 50. If you increase 50 by 50%, you're only adding 25% to it. So you've gone from 100 to 50 to 75, 100 to 50 to 75, you're still down 25%. So you can see where we are now, we're still 20-some-odd% below the peak levels before the recession. Now, fluctuations in the stock market may not mean that much to you, but lots of people who are either in retirement or close to retirement, this becomes a really, really big deal. Now, I've mentioned earlier the debate about macroeconomic policy, and part of that can be related to this whole notion of how active should stabilization policy be. It's not so much a debate whether this policy is good, bad, or indifferent. It's rather a policy. It's a debate about, can policymakers move in a way that will ameliorate or minimize the adverse effects of business fluctuations? Or will they get the timing wrong and other issues, the magnitude wrong, and actually make the situation worse rather than better? So this falls into a camp of what we call activist versus non-activist, where activists said, you know, we've got to trust our policymakers to use their best judgment to react when they can. And the non-activists would say, time out. What we have to recognize is that the economy has a self-correcting mechanism to it. It does have that. Even activists believe that the economy has a self-correcting mechanism to it. So a non-activist would say, let it work itself out. The economy will come back. Remember the question we had earlier? What should we do? Yes, we should intervene. No, we shouldn't intervene. So all of those that you said yes, government policy or market outcomes can be undesirable, are really making an activist argument. Those who want to let the market outcomes rule basically follow into the non-activist camp. Now, a related approach is, if we are going to use monetary and fiscal policy as a way of dealing with the economic fluctuations, how should we do that? Should we have totally discretionary? That is, leave it up to the policymakers to do what they think is best at the time they need to do it? Or should we have some sort of rules-based policy reaction so that if a certain economic event happens, inflation's rising, it tells us automatically what kind of policy to enact? Or if the unemployment rate is rising, it tells us automatically what policy and the order of magnitude of that policy to enact. So we'll look at that debate as well. It's a very interesting one. An eighth issue is, are global trade imbalances a real problem? So trade imbalances are just the mismatch between a country's imports and its exports. It turns out that this mismatch also has significant implications for international lending and borrowing, which we'll see in detail next Thursday, not this Thursday, a week from Thursday. So borrowing and lending. So here's the trade balance for the United States, again, as a percent of U.S. GDP. So this isn't dollar terms, this is percent terms. Again, you'll notice that we've got a generally declining trend up until just recently, where we've seen a significant rebound and then coming down. when countries like the United States run trade deficits, import more than they export, they are borrowing from the rest of the world. Well, as you're probably well aware, when you borrow money, those nasty people who are lending it to you actually want you to pay it back. I think that's totally unreasonable myself, but what can you do? So most of the rest of the world would like or expects the United States to pay back all the borrowing that we've done over the last 30 or 40 years. And as you can see, we're borrowing large amounts of money. So think about this in dollar terms. Let's make this 5% of GDP, so down here. 5% of GDP, but GDP was $15 trillion. So we're talking some very significant dollar amounts, even though the percentages may not look all that erroneous. Okay, last question. Well, maybe it's the last question. What should we do about large trade deficits? Nothing. It'll take care of itself. Okay, just remember, even a broken clock is right twice a day. Force the dollar to depreciate, force the Chinese to appreciate their currency, become energy independent. 1/4 of our trade deficit is energy. Okay, since it's going to take me maybe 12 minutes to actually display this, okay, I've got to figure out, come on. Okay, so there we have it. So some of you want to do nothing, some of you want the dollar to depreciate, some of you want the Chinese to appreciate, and some of you want to become energy independent. Be interesting to see how we actually could accomplish all that. So just to finish here, what we will be doing is using macroeconomic theory and models, a variety of different models, to try and assess how we can explain fluctuations in our major as well as some of the minor economic variables over time, and also to make some sort of assessment about the efficacy or effectiveness of various types of monetary and fiscal policy. Let me just finish by telling you that on Thursday, we are going to cover all of Chapter 2. It's not that long a chapter. It's a lot of definitions and stuff. So it'll help you if you've taken a look at that ahead of time, and we'll have fun going through that. So I'll see you on Thursday and look forward to a great semester.